The essence of this class is that, well, it's something that I noticed when I was working with a nutritional therapist. And it was that she would say, well, you should take these things on a regular basis. And I noticed that when she didn't explain to me the why of it, I somehow felt less committed to doing it, or I didn't understand the value of it. But if she took the time to say, look, this is what it does for your body and this is why it's important, the more that I got that, the more I was like, oh, yeah, of course I would take that. It makes complete sense. And it sounds like a stupid thing. And like, why wasn't I taking it when she recommended it anyway? But it really did help when I understood it well. So this is an attempt to just imbue you with more appreciation of the craft, in part because it can be very hard to master, can be a lot of work, and so on. So if you're a screenwriter, a TV writer, a novelist, a playwright, then you've almost certainly seen a great movie or TV show or read a phenomenal novel or an incredible stage play and really felt like that it was a game changer for you, or that it was a catalyst for transforming your life. And because you're here, great writing probably helped trigger you to want to be a writer. And the more you get into it, the more that great writing encourages you and emboldens you and energizes you and focuses you and all that. But screenwriting, TV writing can look easy because it's been simplified and clarified so much in the writing process. But there's a reason for why screenwriting looks easy, dramatic writing. It's in part because it's an extremely stripped down literary form. And writing for the stage or screen means that the story is being crafted to be performed. It's being written for a performance medium. And that's very demanding and very stripped down. Writing it for a performance medium means it has to be actable and it has to consistently grip an audience. Now, actable means that an actor can perform his or her part in the story in such a way that it clearly communicates the story to the audience as they're watching it, and that the audience is compelled to keep watching, wondering how things will turn out. So the story has to hold the audience in its grip. It has to be riveting. And the audience has to be engaged emotionally, mentally, and even physically on the edge of their seats, white knuckle if it's that intense, but there should be some kind of visceral response, like you really got the audience. And the term that's at the core of it is dramatic action. Dramatic action is a really key concept in writing for the stage or screen. And by screen, I mean any TV or movie. And it's the same in novel writing, of course, too. All these tools are extremely useful for novel writing. I've taught a lot of novelists. Dramatic action is the essence of the craft in many ways, because dramatic action is not things that are happening on stage or on screen. It's not car chases and shootouts. It's a state of action that you put the audience in, a subjective state of excitement, where it means that they're really engaged and that they're drawn into the material, trying to solve the puzzle. How will this end? What's the protagonist thinking? And they're compelled to keep watching. So it's an active engagement. And if you've ever performed live on stage or have friends who are stage actors, they will tell you that it's a huge thrill being on stage. And actors who do live performances know intimately that it's all about the audience. And that even with a hit play, there can be an off night where something about it isn't grabbing the audience. And it's extremely tangible to the actors. And then the next night, the audience might be on fire and It's really electrifying, and it actually amplifies the power of the actor's performance. It brings more to them. So it's a very tangible thing, so that a movie playing to an empty theater has no power. It's just shadows on the wall playing to an empty room. It's not really, nothing's really happening emotionally anywhere. So the power of the film resides entirely in the response of the audience. So that if you don't have the audience on the edge of their seats, you've got nothing. Part of the trick of the whole process is that you have to dramatize story. And what you're doing is turning mere narrative into dramatically compelling presentation. David Mamet's always railing about, we don't need to give them information. Your job is to create drama. And he's absolutely right. It's turning story into drama. Mere information is just stuff, and it doesn't engage them. You want dramatic action, not information. So a central part of your job as a scriptwriter is to dramatize the story, to translate it into something that works in a performance medium. You've got to have a great story, and that's hugely important. If you're putting all this time and energy and focus into poor story, then you just end up with well-structured crap. You have to develop critical eye for a good story. You can't just apply these tools to any old thing. And it's hard to emphasize that enough. So if you're applying all this dramatic technique to a poor story, it's a lot like having a beautifully designed airplane that doesn't fly. It might be gorgeous, but if you can't fly it from New York to Paris reliably, then it's really just a fancy paperweight. It's just like a subway train that can't get in the air. Look at what a complex engineering and construction challenge building a commercial airplane is. There are thousands of parts that all have to work together perfectly, reliably, and seamlessly to even be considered for an FAA inspection to certify it for commercial air traffic. I wouldn't want to try to build a plane myself. I don't know enough about it, first of all, but obviously it's a massive job, and for it to all work perfectly time after time and to have redundant systems and really be reliable and genuinely safe, it's a massive challenge. And yet there are sometimes that many pieces in a great script. There's a lot that has to be integrated all into this one thing. And most of us don't rush home from our flight from Chicago to Los Angeles and say, wow, I'm going to build an airplane, in the same way that a lot of people rush home from a great movie and go, wow, I'm going to write a movie like that. And yet people do that in the movies all the time. They mistake how hard it is, because people who are good at it make it look easy. And part of why it can look easy is that the story has been stripped down to its essence. And only the most simple, basic moving parts are left because the demands of staging the story are so rigorous. I apologize for some of these typos. I dictated this into the machine and I didn't catch everything. So it's just stripped down to its basic moving parts in many instances. If you're watching a stage play, then the only thing you're seeing is the couple in their living room trying to deal with this misunderstanding that has caught them up in this hilarious situation. It's very focused. You're just watching one part of the complete story, but that's the story that's being told, that's being staged. We're not seeing what the guy's little brother is doing upstairs in his bedroom. It's highly focused storytelling. You invent the story and sketch out some tentative possibilities for the plot, and then strip the story to its essence. You're asking, what's really going on in this story in the most basic way? What's it really about? And that can really clarify your thinking, focus your thinking, and focus you on what's being presented in this performance medium. It's a highly specific slice of life in a certain way. And it really comes down to the fact that you only have 2 hours to tell this story. It's a hard, immovable wall. which makes it a highly condensed storytelling format. A movie generally consists of one single complete action, one main action, a single hero, and a single result. And that's a key concept to understand, the idea that there's one main action in a movie. If you look at a movie as complex as, say, The Godfather, which has a lot of moving parts and there's a lot of things going on, there's still one main action. It's that Don Corleone defeats Don Barsini and saves the family. So the ability to see the one main action that's at the core of the story, build everything around that and into that, and get rid of everything else is the essence of cooking a story down to that which is necessary to have on screen. It's a lot like being in a fight where you only get one punch. You have to really make that punch count. And this 2-hour time limit is quite serious. In the theater, the show has to end by a certain time because the last train back to the suburbs leaves at 11 p.m. It's a hard wall. Movie theaters need to empty the theater out, clean up the popcorn, get another audience in there, because they make more money the more people they can get in there. It's important. And obviously, some movies are running longer these days, but these are people who have proven track records, who are making 3-hour movies, 3.5-hour movies. So you have a rigidly limited time frame to work in. Therefore, you need to pull together the mechanics of your plot in a very rigorous fashion. It has to be tight and tidy. You've got to get at that which is necessary to tell the story and rigorously exclude that which is unnecessary. The work of the amateur is characterized by the unnecessary. Amateur screenwriters, playwrights, TV writers overwrite everything in every conceivable direction, and it never ends. When I've taught a tool of mine that specifically separates the necessary from the unnecessary, when I've taught that to development execs at the Hollywood studios, they're all nodding their heads very vigorously, like this is a really crucial thing for people to get, because they read so many scripts that are overwritten in so many ways. It's like a peculiar form of torture. And you hear about pissed off readers, and there's a good reason for that. One of my friends said she no longer teaches screenwriting because she can't stand reading bad screenplays anymore. And I totally get that. Reading a bad screenplay is a lot like going through a plane wreck site, trying to find something that's salvageable. It's catastrophic. I mean, it's shocking how bad some of them can be, and they can be broken in so many different directions and in so many different ways. And conversely, one of the funniest things I heard a few months ago was one of my newer students who was saying, I had said something in my 3-month course 1 about bad screenplays. And he said, I don't think I've read a bad screenplay. Do you know where I could find any? And I swear, I was like, oh my God, that's probably the funniest thing I've heard this year. You know, you could literally, if you said that to, like, you know, script readers or development executives, they would literally be rolling on the floor laughing that you can't find a bad screenplay. And so you're working in an extremely well-defined set of parameters in this particular storytelling medium. It's a very specific thing. And the story is built around one main character, and the audience is totally focused on this protagonist. And it's actually a very intimate experience between you and the audience and the protagonist on screen or on stage. In a movie, you are up close and personal with the main character, not only inhabiting their world with them, but very much, in essence, pretending to be that main character. It's a really interesting psychological mechanism. And people are wired for this type of intimate connection from birth. We are ideally suited to this close connection with the protagonist that's generated in a film TV show, stage play, or novel. We really feel connected to them. When a baby is born, it's wired to connect to human faces, and it bonds immediately with its mother. And a young baby is so focused on its mother that it will notice you when you walk into the room, but it's still quite focused on its mother. And we're made for that. We're like genetically engineered to do that. And it's part of how we survive. And we do the same thing with the protagonist in a story. It's like surfing a wave. It's already there, and you just have to get on it, this psychological trait that we have. So that if you can align your protagonist with the audience and get the audience to root for the protagonist and to keep rooting for the protagonist, they naturally do that. And it's important to distinguish between likability, which is not necessary, and rooting for the protagonist. People often say you need to make your protagonist more likable, but technically that's incorrect, because even though it's correct for a lot of stories, it's not always true, and therefore it's not exactly the right term. You have to really be rooting for them. Sometimes our hero in a story is the most brash, rebellious, take no shit from anybody, doesn't get pushed around, is exactly the right person for the job that needs to be done. And the fact is that the more of a troublemaker they are, the more perfect they are for this particular mission or that type of thing. And likability sometimes is not a factor at all. So bonding with the protagonist is, we do the same thing that a baby does, with a newborn baby does with its mother when we're in a theater, where our entire experience is wrapped up in the fate of the protagonist. And we're laser focused on that character. Now, you might not notice that explicitly while it's happening, but you will be aware of the fact that after you leave a movie theater, you often feel like that protagonist. Like you're walking around, getting the keys to your car, and you feel like, the person you've just been watching, you have their traits and you feel like you actually are that person. It's an interesting phenomenon and fascinating. And it's often fun to feel like that person because you like them. You want to be like them. You've become like them. So you're feeling like this movie star that just defeated the story's antagonist and won back the love of his life. Sorry for these misspellings, are me narrating to the computer. I thought I caught all of it, but I knew I didn't. So this is a tangible thing. It's a lot like you're an actor who's gotten into character for a role you're going to play. You're in character. And movies take advantage of the fact that we're wired this way, and it's part of why movies affect us so deeply and powerfully. And this is just one aspect of why a movie, TV show, stage play, or novel can affect us so powerfully. But that only happens when it's done right. And there's an awful lot of ways to do it wrong. And when it's wrong, almost doesn't count. So that if they do any part of that wrong, then we find ourselves in the audience disconnecting from the protagonist or from the story. And that's disappointing. In fact, it's way more than disappointing. It can be infuriating. We were getting what we needed, but then it fizzled out. It stopped giving us this experience that we crave. The relationship between the audience and whatever they're watching or reading is not casual. In fact, it's extremely demanding. Part of your job as a scriptwriter is to pay attention to audience demand. And yet audience demand is not something that's easily visible on the surface of things, but it is a very real thing. And you have to pay attention to it as a writer. You have to work with it and serve it and utilize it. And the best way to get a look at audience demand is to remember the last time you had heard something phenomenal about a movie and you're all excited and you go see it and it sucked. Look at your response then. It isn't like, oh, well, too bad it didn't work. It's like, I needed that. Come on. I was really came in and I wanted that. and it didn't do it and I'm pissed. It's not like, oh, well, too bad. That's there. You can really put your finger on audience demand. It's a real thing. It's just under the surface a lot. And if you came in with no expectations and the movie was lame, then you're like, oh, well, too bad I wasted 2 hours. But it's when you're really, somebody said, you got to go see this. It's phenomenal. And you hated it. There's something in you that was demanding a certain something. So this distinct hunger is something to pay attention to. It's a demand. And they say that a great artist gives the audience what they want, even if the audience themselves isn't aware of what they want. So the more that you can tap into this deep hunger that drives an audience in a particular type of story, in a romantic comedy, they're looking for a certain something. And in a great thriller, they're looking for a certain something. And if you can identify that and tap into it, you can really utilize the energy of the audience. And that's a deeper level of understanding audience demand. And as I talked about, if you ever acted in front of a live audience, then you know how much the show depends upon a powerful response by that audience. If they're looking at their watches and checking their phones, then you're in trouble. And in live theater, even when the show is a hit, sometimes there's an off night. And it's hard to put your finger on what's not clicking that night, but it's very tangible. And when the show is really working, it's a real high for the actors. It's one of the reasons they do this. There was some story I saw recently. It was a little anecdote. It said, I got bored in life, so I got into parachute jumping. And then when that started to get boring, I bought a theater. And then when that started to get boring, I got up on stage and acted. So when the audience is on, it changes everything. And that's what it's all about. And if you can tap into this deep hunger of the audience and deliver what they're really hungry for, then the intensity of the audience actually amplifies the power of the story as it's unfolding. I remember when Pulp Fiction came out, I saw it one day and then took my girlfriend right back to it the next day. And because I had just seen it the day before, I was also paying attention to the audience around us. And there was a distinctly tangible electricity in the air. It was almost like crackling energy. People were literally electrified, and watching it in a crowd really added to the power of the experience. One of my friends was a film critic in Chicago, and he said that he hated The Wedding Crashers. And I was like, are you kidding? How could you not love that movie? That was one of the most fun experiences we had that whole summer, was sitting in a crowd roaring with laughter at all this insanely funny stuff. And he goes, oh, I never watch it with an audience. I hate that. I always go in the private screening room for critics. And I was like, come on, a movie like The Wedding Crashers, you wait 5 years for a movie like that to come along. And, the communal experience of being right there with a bunch of people is definitely part of it. So if you can tap into audience demand, it actually multiplies the power of your story. So there are a lot of moving parts in an effective drama. And by drama, I mean any story that's built to be performed, whether it's a goofy comedy, a horror story, a thriller, or a romantic comedy. Whatever it is, it has to work dramatically. Liar, Liar with Jim Carrey is funny, but it also works dramatically. And all these tools work brilliantly in novels as well, because it adds power to your story. It makes it more compelling. But however complex the inner mechanism of an effective drama is, it still has to be extremely stripped down. There isn't time to embellish the story or to wander off on tangents. It's similar to haiku in a number of ways. It's really stripped down. And in fact, it can be hard to cut your own writing because you fall in love with certain turns of a phrase or scenes or things that from an objective point of view shouldn't be in there, and just weigh it down and drag it off in the wrong direction, or a distraction, or slow it down. And a technique that I invented works quite well for that. I call it the throwaway cut. And this is like the kind of thing where my script is 140 pages and I can't find anything else to cut, and help, I'm stuck. And so you print an extra copy of the script that you know you're going to throw away, and you just go crazy editing it. You just, instead of going, oh, I don't know if I can lose this word, I spent 4 weeks crafting it and honing it. Instead, you just come in knowing that this is just a disposable copy, and you just go, screw that, lose that, who cares, chop that. There's no, if you think, should I lose that or not? I'm just like, lose it, who cares? And you just get slap happy and just throw everything away because it doesn't matter. You're just going, who cares, lose that. And when you get through that, then you take out the real script and you edit, and it loosens you up. You already loosened up, and you're already kind of broke through the, I built that with my own hands, so how could I possibly throw it away? I thought it up, so how could it not be brilliant? And you want to keep that extra copy as you're doing your real edit, in case you're like, wait, how did I solve that scene? I like chopped a whole bunch of stuff out of it and it seemed like it was working better. So go back and open it up and see what you did. But you really are going to throw that script away, and it gives you great freedom. So writing a script can look easy because it's been simplified and clarified in the process of writing it properly. If you watch a world-class surfer spring to her feet on a 50-foot wave, there's an elegance to the motion that can make it look almost effortless and easy. But if you've ever been out in big surf, where one wave is 100,000 tons of water moving at 25 miles an hour, you know what a truly impressive athletic feat it is to leap to your feet quickly on a surfboard on a massive wave like that. And have you ever watched someone get up on a unicycle, get their balance, and pedal around? It can look reasonably easy. They sort of jump onto the seat, work the pedals back and forth as they hold their hands out to get their balance, and you're like, I could probably do that. How hard could it be? It's a lot like riding a bike in many ways. But if you've ever actually tried to ride a unicycle, it's crazy hard. We had one when I was a kid, and I'm not sure if I ever really got good at it. And yet there's people that do mountain biking on unicycles. They're going from boulder top to boulder top. They play hockey on unicycles. It's insane. And juggling might look reasonably easy, especially with 3 balls. They're just tossing one ball up while they catch another and getting into a regular rhythm. Walking on a tightrope can seem doable. You just get your balance, move slowly, and keep your focus. I've tried all 3 of them, and they're all much harder than they look. But each one is reasonably manageable, not impossible. Takes some definite practice for sure, even just to begin to get the hang of it. And it takes a lot of work to master it, but it's not impossible. You're just juggling 3 balls. But then watch someone at a circus go up on a tightrope, get up on a unicycle, and start juggling up there as they pedal along. And you can really see the degree of difficulty involved. You're not sitting there going, oh, I could do that. You're going, whoa, how, I wouldn't even know where to start. And the fact of the matter is that dramatic writing is considered the single hardest form of writing anywhere. And this is true. A lot of professional writers say this because it's so stripped down. You have to cook it right down to its essence. You don't have room to improvise, go off on tangents. It demands that you use less words to say the same thing and to be crystal clear and to write for a performance medium and to consistently hold the audience in its thrall. So it's considered the most elusive of all the literary disciplines. It's tricky, it's slippery, it's hard to pin down. Even a high-level writer who's being paid millions of dollars may not know exactly why the last script worked brilliantly and may not know why this one's creating so many problems. And skilled professionals get in over their head with each new script. I was just reading an interview with Shane Black where he said, I always thought it would get easier, and it kept getting harder. And if you're not getting in over your head, you're not doing your job right. And a lot of people who don't have much craft, who don't have much skill and technique as a writer, make safe choices because they know they can make that work on the page. And the safe choices make the material weak, predictable, that kind of thing, cliche. But the more craft you have, the more you can get in over your head and make it work. So the tools and techniques and habits of mind and underlying principles all help your process so that you can tend to consistently make scripts work. But they say it keeps getting harder instead of getting easier. And on the other end of the spectrum, you can have the person who doesn't have a lot of craft as a writer, but turns out a script that works wonderfully, but then gets in deep trouble on their next script. They don't know why this one isn't working, and they don't know why the first one worked. But if you have substantial craft as a dramatist, then you'll tend to be able to reliably make scripts work. You'll tend to be able to be consistent. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy, but that you can tend to get in the ballpark with each script, rather than sometimes it's like wildly not working and you have no idea why. So the craft of turning a good story into an acceptable and consistently compelling stage play has been evolving for many thousands of years. Some stories put the audience to sleep, and some keep them on the edge of their seats for the whole show. And there are certain things that tend to be common among those stories that really grip an audience. Collectively, this craft, which is a mixture of art and science, is known as dramaturgy or dramatic technique. And they're not rules, but they're rather guidelines or underlying principles or things that tend to work. And again, this story has to work in this performance medium. The Oscar for Best Actor is called Best Performance by an actress in a leading role. So first of all, you've got to have a really good story. Otherwise, it's like trying to cook a gourmet meal with spoiled food. Well-structured crap is still crap. But even when you've got a great story, it has to work when actors perform it for an audience. In theater, they have a great term for it. They say, that story might sound great around a campfire, but it's not stage-worthy. And it's a term that I really love because it hits it right on the nose. It's not an effective drama when it's performed, and not every novel makes a good screenplay or stage play. And not every novelist is automatically a good dramatist. And in fact, some really gifted novelists have written horrific plays or movies. It's a specific technique. So there's a similar term in shipbuilding called seaworthy, same as stage-worthy. However great the ship may look in dry dock, if it's not seaworthy, as in it's good in a storm, it handles well, it does what it needs to in all kinds of conditions, then it's essentially worthless. So here is a quote from a script doctor from Broadway around 1900. He said, playwriting is an art that has taken centuries to develop, that it requires time and application to master its requirements, and that he must have at his fingers' end before he can possibly possess the professional touch. And this is William Thompson Price. So you really want to build this into you as a deep habit, preferably before you start writing. It will take years off your learning curve and your career, launching your career. And so if you've studied any of the tools that I teach, you will see me talking about things like dilemma. And it might seem like that's not a very big deal, like, so what? You give your protagonist a problem. Everybody does that, a goal and an obstacle, that's old news. But a dilemma is a highly specific type of problem. It's forcing your protagonist to choose between two equally unacceptable alternatives, between two equally painful choices. And that's a specific thing. It really traps your protagonist so that he or she cannot make that choice. Neither option is good at all. And this dilemma creates an internal paralysis in the protagonist that can be really gripping to the audience. And the more universal that dilemma is, the more the audience can relate to it, has lived it, and in fact is living it now if it's truly universal. And if they see the protagonist caught up in something that they themselves are trapped in, then it can be especially compelling because they wonder, can this protagonist find a way out of the thing that I'm trapped in that I can't find a way out of? So the more that you can align the dilemma of your protagonist with the average member of the audience, the more the whole audience will be completely caught up in the story. So it's part of the craft of the dramatist is to go deep into what you're writing about. They say the deeper you go, the more universal it gets. And it really grabs people where they live. And this can be mesmerizing. So maybe this protagonist can find some kind of solution to one of life's fundamental problems that I can't solve, that I'm stuck in my own life. Drama is a crucible, and a crucible in chemistry is where you can mix dangerous chemicals. In steel making, it's the thing that holds the molten steel. So it's a place where we can experiment with dangerous chemicals, dangerous reactions. And the drama gives us a way to experiment with potential radical solutions to situations that can stump us in real life. If we're in a marriage that isn't working, it's not easy to experiment with a radical potential solution, because if it doesn't work, then there goes the rest of your marriage. But we can participate in a drama on stage about a potential radical solution to a failing marriage because we're observing it from a safe distance. We can put out our feelers and do a taste test to see how would that work if we tried that? Could that actually work? And you can stand back and go, that could be interesting, but God, I don't know. But you can really try it out. It shows us a way that we might transform our own lives and can give us the energy and encouragement to do so. A great drama can really energize and embolden the audience. Think about movies or TV series or stage plays or novels that changed your life. This really happens on a regular basis. And it's one of the great things about a great movie is that it can set you on a new course in life and hit the reset button and send you off energized with a clear vision of how you can live. And that's one of the really dynamic challenges of being a writer. Like, can the complete action of your story change your audience's life forever? Because audiences are starving for that. And it's doable. It's quite a challenge. And as you go way back in history, you'll find that the stage and the altar were the same thing. The stage was essentially was literally an altar upon which religious dramas about the transformation of the hero were enacted. And it was for the benefit of those people who were gathered there, to show them how to transform themselves. So part of a great ending to a story can be a substantial emotional transformation for the protagonist that translates directly into the audience because they so closely identify with the story's protagonist. It can really kick you into gear, give you a new insight, a new take on life. And specifically, the protagonist actively and conclusively and irreversibly resolving his or her dilemma is what the ending consists of, if your story consists of one good, strong dilemma. If your story is about one good, strong dilemma, and that dilemma builds to a crisis where that dilemma has come to its breaking point and the protagonist now has to make some kind of decision and take a key action about this dilemma, then you're really driving the audience through a change and keeping them riveted. And then by the end of the story, the protagonist actively, conclusively, and irreversibly resolves that dilemma, then it's a complete transformation that can really powerfully affect the audience. And the way in which the protagonist resolves the dilemma expresses the theme of the story. So it's not what the protagonist does, but it's the way in which the protagonist resolves the dilemma. And then you can put your finger on the theme that's emerging organically through the complete action of the story. And the theme is what resonates emotionally in the audience when they leave the theater. It's the actual product in one way. It's what they take home. Where if you've just seen a great romantic comedy, you leave the theater feeling happy and in love, and the way in which the protagonist overcame his own internal flaw and won over the girl in the end and created happiness and love, you've been imbued with that. And so all this is part of the craft of the dramatist, to take the complete action of a story and transfer that into the audience. It's all about the audience. And so by drawing crisp distinctions in the technique that you're using, you get specificity, which helps with clarity. Clarity of technique helps make your story work better dramatically. If you muddy those distinctions every time they become inconvenient, then you lose the power of the tools. A dilemma is two equally unacceptable alternatives. If you have two unacceptable alternatives, but they're not equally unacceptable, then one is an easier way out, and electricity will always take the path of least resistance. But if they're equally unacceptable, then the protagonist cannot make a decision in either direction. So you want to use that tool explicitly. And the distinction is that, are they equally unacceptable or are they not? And if they're not, then try to get them to where they're equally unacceptable. Make one side of the situation worse. And now they're equally unacceptable. And then you have that frozen short circuiting in the middle where you can't sacrifice one child or sacrifice the other. You can't possibly even begin to make a decision if you're stuck in that dilemma. So a good, strong dilemma that builds to a crisis and forces the protagonist to make a decision and action about the dilemma at this critical juncture leads to a powerful resolution, which helps you understand the story's theme. So using each of these particular parts of a tool correctly helps you make a drama that is effective, as opposed to a drama that doesn't work. So if you have solid craft as a dramatist, you tend to be better in general at turning a good story into a great script. And some people argue that paying attention to technique can disrupt the creative process. But the point is to develop deep habits of mind as a trained dramatist so that it becomes second nature and so that you can focus completely on creating your story. A trained surgeon has solid technique at their fingertips, and their focus is on the patient, not on their technique. So the more craft you have built into you, the more you can be completely focused on the story that you're creating, and you draw from the tools and their underlying principles as they're needed. So you want to focus on acquiring deep mastery as a dramatist. This is not a set of rules like paint by number. It's a way of thinking. It's about mastery of a set of principles that guide the choices you make as you build a story into a compelling drama in any genre. The genius is in the principles. The principles guide your application of the technique. There are certain techniques that you use, and there are certain principles that underlie those techniques and are part of why those techniques were created and what those techniques help you do to the story. And the more that you understand the underlying principles, the more that informs your application of the technique. You know why you're doing this particular technique to this part of the story. And you can adjust the technique as needed because you understand the principle of the thing. And each new story brings with it a unique set of problems and puzzles. So you adjust your technique to solving them, guided by the underlying principles that make these tools work. It makes you more fluid and capable as a writer because you're not rigid. You just know what you're doing and you can adjust as needed and flex. Here's another quote from William Thompson Price. He was a legendary Broadway script doctor around 1900. He was a play reader for a number of famous producers, and one of them was David Belasco. There's still Belasco Theater on Broadway, and Price revised every script for him before it went up on stage. And so many writers were asking Price for advice that he formed the first school of playwriting ever in the history of the world, the American School of Playwriting in 1901. And he had 28 students and 24 of them had hits on Broadway. And I spent 3 years reading his book and one of his students' book and found in it some very unique tools that were somewhat well known back in the 20s and 30s, but are largely forgotten now and are actually a different branch of classical dramaturgy in a certain way. It all comes from thousands of years of classical dramaturgy, but people like Sid Field, a lot of people draw from what's known as Freytag's pyramid. They talk about a rising action, but this incorporates a lot of that stuff, but has somewhat different terminology and slightly different applications and just a different way of tackling the same problems. But this came from an intense study of Price. Let me actually read you this quote on Price. Eventually, Price was able to formulate his law of plot, the proposition, which we are quite willing to agree is the one significant contribution to the science of playwriting since Aristotle's Poetics. This was the judgment of many of his students, among whom were the most successful American dramatists of their generation. It is a large remark, but as we say, we do not dispute it, even though Price's very name seems unknown to the public or to the scholars these days. If we ourselves were asked to whom we were indebted for the basis of our ideas about playwriting, we should have to answer Aristotle and Price. So this guy is a serious theorist and practitioner of advanced dramatic technique, but he's largely unknown. Here's another quote by him. He is on the road to understanding if he takes a watch to pieces in order to ascertain the relations of its various parts. He will not be a watchmaker until he understands all the principles that have led to the devising of their various parts. There is a certain mechanism about playwriting that is just as distinct as the mechanism of a watch. And all the tools that he's teaching for playwriting work perfectly for screenwriting. It's all the craft of the dramatist. And here's David Mamet talking about having solid craft as a dramatist. It's very difficult to shore up something that has been done badly. You'd better do your planning up front when you have the time. It's like working with glue. When it sets, you've used up your time. When it's almost set, you have to make quick decisions under pressure. If you design a chair correctly, you can put all the time into designing it correctly and assemble it at your leisure. And that's part of the core principles of what I teach, is that you can take most of the energy that goes into rewrites and put it into engineering your script properly before you write it. And here's David Mamet again. It's good, as the Stoics tell us, to have tools that are simple to understand and of a very limited number, so that we may locate and employ them on a moment's notice. I think the essential tools in any worthwhile endeavor are incredibly simple and very difficult to master. The task of any artist is not to learn many, many techniques, but to learn the most simple technique perfectly. In doing so, Stanislavski tells us, the difficulty will become easy and the easy habitual, so that the habitual may become beautiful. It says it really well. You don't need 1,000 tools. You need a few great tools and get really, really good at them so they're built into you. And here's a few more quotes from Price, kind of a random scattering of them. Playwriting is a process of reasoning, and the mind cannot cooperate with the heart with precision until it is able to think in dramatic terms, just as one must be able to think in a language before he can fairly claim to be its master. So, you see, you have to look out for a great many things in playwriting, but they will not be burdensome to you in the application of your art when you know how to apply it. On the contrary, a pleasure. An inexperienced writer can so arrange his material, innocently thinking that he had a play, that there would not be a particle of drama in it. So you can put together a story and feel like you've created a play, but actually none of it works dramatically. Comparisons are not always conclusive, but it is absolutely certain that you can no more be a born playwright than you can be a born chemist. So many people talk about dramatic instinct, and Price always said, dramatic instinct is a massive illusion, and they're not going to give you a license as a pharmacist when you go down there and say, oh, I have great instincts as a pharmacist. It's not happening, and it's the same type of thing. It's a craft. You may have great instincts as a storyteller, but the ability to put together good stories into dramas that tend to consistently work is a very specific craft. I found that nothing could be done with the individual who, although he had read everything ever written on the subject, knew nothing of the art of playwriting. It required the expenditure of too much vital energy to combat this self-confident ignorance. It was the bottomless pit. Playwriting is an art which has taken centuries to develop, that it requires time and application to master its requirements, and that he must have it at his fingers' ends before he can possibly possess the professional touch. The inherent characteristic of every art is that it reduces its principles to terms. And if you do not understand those terms and the full meaning of each principle in all its aspects, you are not an artist. It's like if you are a contractor who can build any kind of house, then you understand all the principles involved in construction and the engineering principles, how you connect things, how you waterproof things, how you make it all work. And you understand all that deeply and fully. The drama is the most economical of arts. The completion of a play rests with the words. After everything else is done, they must be supplied. This is a play in which the medium of words is relied upon to a considerable extent, as is the case with all dramas in verse, and yet its compactness is nowhere more evident than in its words. Every word counts. And Christ says that the words come last. People who sit down and try to just start typing up a script without having thought through and solved all the problems and puzzles that are inherent in it get stuck, get what they think is writer's block, but it's actually a lack of proper preparation. So what does it mean to construct a plot? There's varying parts of the craft. Story creation, we touched on that in some ways, that there's got to be a good story, and you got to be able to tell the difference. In the world of horses, they talk about how someone is a good judge of horseflesh. Like they go to a sale and they'll look at two horses and go, buy that one, don't buy that one. And you could look at them and God, I can't tell the difference. But the expert is like, no, do not buy that horse and pay anything for this horse. You have to have that as a storyteller, the ability to evaluate material and the ability to evaluate your own material. And there's story development. And some of that is what we were talking about in terms of dilemma and so on, where you're adjusting the story to create a dilemma, or finding the dilemma that's inherent in the material and amplifying it, focusing it, clarifying it, bringing the power of that dilemma up and making it more powerful while also making it more universal. Because just because you have a dilemma in your story with the protagonist trapped between two equally unacceptable alternatives doesn't mean that the audience is going to automatically be riveted. You have to pay attention to the audience. There's what's called trying to dictate an emotional response, where you're telling the audience that this is what they have to feel, as opposed to earning it. You know, it's and you've seen that in movies or TV shows you're watching, where they're saying, oh, this kid has cancer and his mom's been up all night milking the cows and you have to care. And you're like, I know I'm supposed to, but I really don't. And that's realistic. That's part of the equation. You can't tell people they have to care. You have to earn it. You have to find out what they really care about and align what they really care about with what you're writing about. You're paying attention to your audience. It's all about the audience. And you're working to align your story with them and what they care about. So there's story creation, there's story development, character development, which we didn't talk about here, but the Enneagram is extraordinarily useful for that. You can check out the website, enneagraminstitute.com. If you get a subscription, in my subscription program, there's a lot of material on that in the roughly 70 videos and articles in there that can give you deep instruction in these things. And then there's plot construction, which is taking the story that you've developed and actually building the plot, the mechanics of the plot. And scripts are more constructed than written. The people that really know what they're doing generally don't just sit down and start typing. They think it through and figure it out and wrestle with it and work it out on 3x5 cards and structure an outline and tinker with it, because you can take much of the energy that goes into rewrites and put it into engineering the script properly before you write it. And not everybody works that way. Some people just sit down and start typing, but it's easy to get in trouble that way. And the professionals that do it that way can often get really stuck and, can even talk about having writer's block for years. So amateurs who sit down and start typing often hit what's called the brick wall at around page 40 or 50. This means that they've figured out enough of the plot to get a good start, but then they're confronted with a constellation of problems that they haven't yet figured out, and which are too complex to unravel by just writing more scenes. It's a number of different compound, complex problems, and you can get really stumped. So if you're building a hotel, you don't just start at the bottom and build the first room in complete detail so you can walk in there and it's carpeted and painted and all that stuff, and then move on to the next room. You put up the steel girders and beams of this hotel, which determines its shape. Then you put in the floors and walls. Then you put in the plumbing and wiring. Then you put in the sheetrock and you paint the walls. And then you put in the final trim and the electrical plate covers and the carpeting and all that stuff. But you do it systematically and layer by layer. You work from the general to the particular, gradually developing the detail as it becomes necessary. And as I said, the words come last. Dialogue and final description are details that are part of the overall plot, and each of the parts serves the whole. Each scene serves the overall story and moves the story ahead another notch. There are roughly 2 to 5 scenes in a sequence. Each scene is a complete unit in the overall story. There are roughly 2 to 5 sequences in an act. Each act is a major component of the overall story. All the different parts of the story are subordinate to the whole. They all serve the whole. The one thing that the story's doing is what everything in that story is contributing towards. Every part of the story has a distinct function in the same way that every part and component of a nuclear attack sub serves a highly distinct function. There's nothing on that sub that does not serve its overall function. So you want to get the broad strokes of the overall story's general framework working properly before you develop any details. If the big picture doesn't work, the details do not matter. A beautifully finished room in a house that's falling down is useless. You can have oak trim, gold leaf, exotic carpeting and such, but if the house is caving in and tipping over, then all that ornate detail means nothing. So you might see people with a beautifully written scene in a script that doesn't work. It's useless. Aristotle said that a writer constructing a story should first sketch its general outline and then fill in the episodes and amplify in detail. So that's an interesting, crystal clear statement of how to construct a story. First, sketch in the general outline. That's the main thing. If the general outline doesn't work, then filling in the episodes and amplifying in detail is pointless. So the best way to construct a plot is to put together an outline that works in the most general way, and then gradually layer in detail as it becomes necessary. And you can see this if, say, a general is planning an attack that will take a city. The general is looking at the big picture and the broad strokes. And, you take your platoon in on this side of the city, and take out the defenses on that end. And you bring your platoon in on this side and go right for the reservoir. We got to have the water. And this platoon, get that bridge no matter what. I don't care if every one of you dies, hold that bridge. That's the single most important thing of the entire attack. So there's major things that are being factored in. But one of the sergeants comes up to the general and says, what are we going to do for food on the third day? He's like, well, there'll be food in the city. You can, you're going to bring some in with you. If we're 3 days into this and you can't find a loaf of bread and a stick of salami, then we got bigger problems than that. Like, I don't have time to deal with that stuff. I'm trying to make it so we can even get into the city. My tanks haven't even come up yet. So the details before you need them only serve to gum things up. If you're building a skyscraper and putting the girders and beams together for the underlying framework, and one of your workers comes rushing up to you in a panic and says, hey, boss, what about the wallpaper in the bathroom on the 10th floor? You say, well, we'll get to that when we get there. I don't need to think about that now. It just confuses things. Come up here and help me bolt on the 90th floor. Premature. What you want to do is you want to be free from the profusion of unnecessary detail. And that's an important underlying principle, that you gradually develop the detail as it becomes necessary. And this all goes into properly engineering your script before you write it. Amateurs often throw something together, then pour a ton of energy into rewrites, trying to salvage something from the wreckage. They talk about this as a vomit draft, which to me is a catastrophic waste of time. But I've also been trained to engineer it before you write it. Not everybody has that temperament, and some people have to just jump in, get something down on paper to see what they got. But one of my former students, who's a successful playwright, said that just getting something down on paper and then 3, 4, 5 drafts later, you're starting to go, oh, I see what this story is really about. He goes, by the time I've gotten there, I'm sick of the damn thing. I've been through it so many times. He said, it's so much easier to work in an outline form and figure out what the story's about as you're developing the story and beginning to construct it, that you're able to do the long haul of wrestling with the story much better without losing patience with it or losing your passion for it. Because that passion carries you through a lot of long, hard work. You don't want to blunt that. If you put most of that energy into figuring out your script properly before you actually write the scenes, then what you write will tend to be pretty solid and won't need anywhere near as much rewriting. It'll be a decent execution of what you plotted, rather than a mess that needs major work in every direction. And by only layering in detail as it becomes necessary, you are freed from the profusion of unnecessary detail. And what you end up doing is going, if you figured out the broad strokes of the story, then you go back through those broad strokes and go, okay, so there's a key betrayal here. So what might that look like? Well, it's this person who's going to do the betraying. And I know that they're lying about this, but I haven't figured out how they would be lying or why people didn't guess that they were lying. And you don't need full detail. You just need you walk back through it and go, okay, so what would this look like in just a little more detail? And the key is like just a little more detail. You don't need full and final detail. If that comes to you, put it down in your notebook, but don't clutter up your outline with it. You just layer in, you just figure out just a little more. Well, he would probably be lying in this way because it seems more believable. and maybe he distracts people with something else. So you're just kind of gradually figuring out the mechanics and figuring out a little bit of detail on each pass. So you can sketch out a section of the story in very general terms and refrain from figuring out the detail until you have to. Figuring out too much detail prematurely is often a waste of time, since stories grow and change constantly. And it can gum up the works because instead of having a light, simple framework, you have a constellation of details that is much harder to change as the story grows. If you read an entire script, then you've committed to figuring out and putting down on paper a massive amount of detail. And if there are major problems with the story, then instead of merely shifting a lightweight outline around, you have to chip apart these details that have been poured in concrete, rethink them, recalibrate them, and rebuild with them. And it's often a massive waste of time and effort. A good analogy is like in the old wagon train days, if you're the scout for that wagon train trying to find a good pass through the mountains, all you have is a pouch over your shoulder and a rifle. And you're running. You're not dragging tool chests and all this stuff. You're moving fast and light. And you might go halfway up a mountain and go, damn, didn't know there was a waterfall here. There's no way we can come through here. So you go back down and go around the other way until you find the right way. So you want to be able to move fast and light and keep it simple until you make it actually work. And then you layer in just a little more detail and just a little more. And it's the same analogy of like, if you're building a hotel, you do the steel framework first, then the walls and floors, then the plumbing and wiring, then the sheetrock and the paint, and then the final trim, electric cover plates, and all that. You gradually do it as it becomes necessary. So with proper training and solid technique, you can get the broad strokes of the story right, then flesh out the details that are necessary to execute all that, and then layer in the final detail before you actually write the pages. In the photograph below, you can see, what does that say? You can see, I was dictating this at like 3 a.m. last night, but in the photograph below, you can see the entire structure that is built, and all you have to do is layer in the final detail. This framework to a plane, it's going to have an engine put in it and so on, but to make it fly, you're just putting sheet metal around the frame of it, and it works. Most of the plane is there, and you've systematically built that up. And that's the same thing you can do with the plot. All of that helps you assemble that which is necessary to make the plot work. But another major thing to pay attention to is to keep the unnecessary detail out of the script. The work of the amateur is characterized by the unnecessary. Amateurs overwrite everything in every possible direction. Dialogue and description, entire scenes that shouldn't be in the script, sequences that shouldn't be in the script, sometimes even entire act. I one time described to a client of mine who was extensively overwriting everything. I said, it's like I want to just go for a brisk walk and there's 2 feet of snow and I have to shovel snow at every step just to get anywhere. Dialogue is overwritten, description is overdone, whole scenes shouldn't be in there, sometimes a whole sequence, occasionally an entire act. The unnecessary has flooded in and gummed up everything. And Price jokes, and it's not really a joke, he said, sometimes your entire script might be unnecessary. Like, yes, there's a scene that shouldn't be in there, there's a sequence that shouldn't be in there, there's an act that shouldn't be in there. The whole script doesn't have anything that is actually necessary. And it might sound funny, but if you know any studio readers, ask them if they've ever read an entire script that was unnecessary, and they probably have a landfill that's nothing but that. Thousands and thousands of scripts that have nothing working in them. And I was in a big producer's office one time, and she had a stack of, shelves, a whole wall of shelves, floor to ceiling. And she said, Have you seen any good scripts? Not one of those over there is worth anything. It's like water, water everywhere, but no fresh water. 99% of all scripts are rejected. And that's true even with all the seminars and screenwriting gurus and film schools and everything. It's much, much harder than people imagine. And there's so many things that have to go right. And if any one of them goes wrong, the damn thing doesn't work. So it's very tricky. And part of that is to assemble that which is necessary and to ferociously keep out the unnecessary. It's like having a clean room in a computer chip manufacturing plant where they don't want a single piece of dust in there, and they go to great lengths to do that. It's that kind of rigorous, warlike, ruthless exclusion. The ability to create only that which is strictly necessary to the forward progression of the story's action and to rigorously exclude the unnecessary is a hugely important skill. The unnecessary is always ready to flood in the same way that the ocean that surrounds the dikes in the Netherlands is. A lot of Holland is below sea level, so they built these dikes and it keeps out the ocean. And yet, the ocean is ready to flood in at any given moment. The unnecessary kills scripts just as surely as a mudslide coming down the mountainside will destroy your home. The amount of crap that people try to pack into a script is astonishing and makes readers want to murder someone. And there is a specific technique to separate the necessary from the unnecessary, and that is reverse cause and effect. Once you've got the basics of your story figured out, you can construct the plot by starting at the ending and chaining backward from each effect to its cause. So at each step, you're only asking, what is the cause of that specific effect? Any number of things happened before that effect, but only one thing actually caused it. And that's how you separate the necessary from the unnecessary. Say that your sister wakes you up early one morning and says, you wouldn't believe the dream I just had. It was so vivid. I dreamed that you won the lottery, and it was like the most realistic, electrifying dream I've ever had. And you gotta go buy a lottery ticket right this second. Like, don't even get out of your pajamas, just jump in your car and go buy it. And so you go to buy the lottery ticket, and a number of things might happen before you buy your lottery ticket. Like you get a coffee and a Danish, and you almost get bitten by somebody walking their dog. And those things happen before buying the ticket. But the cause of you buying the ticket is that your sister said you have got to go do it now. So there's the distinction between those things that merely happened before it and the one thing that actually caused it. And if you can create the spine of your story by chaining backward from each effect to its cause, and then what's the cause of that? What's the cause of that? Then when you read the story from its beginning, this causes this, which causes this, which causes this, and it has a good forward flow, and it's unencumbered by unnecessary detail. And you can tell a story well that doesn't go off on tangents, doesn't get caught up in distractions, and doesn't get slowed down. And so by adhering rigorously to this tight chain of cause and effect and not allowing any unnecessary detail whatsoever to clog up the forward action of the plot, you construct a clean plot that consists only of the necessary. It's like building a rocket. You're putting together the rocket with what you need to launch it, navigate it, orbit, and there's nothing else in that rocket at all. Only the necessary. And rocket scientists are ruthless about extra weight, because every extra pound you have to launch into orbit, you need like 3 pounds of rocket fuel, which adds more weight, and it just balloons exponentially. So they're ferocious about, no, you cannot put your kid's 8-ounce science experiment in the damn rocket. I'll shoot you, I'll bite your legs off, get away with that thing. So you do this for the overall story, reverse cause and effect for the broad strokes of the story in simple terms. Then you do it for each act, where you figure it out in a little more detail, but still having tight cause and effect for that act. But you're inventing just a little bit more to make that act work, but only as much detail as it takes to make that act work. Then you do the same thing for each sequence. Layer in just a little more detail, and it still has cause and effect. You're still going backwards to what's the cause of that, what's the cause of that. Then you do it for the first scene, tight cause and effect back through that scene, and then you write that scene. Then you do it for the next scene, and then you write that scene. And when you write that scene, you're still rigorously separating the necessary from the unnecessary, so that dialogue is trimmed down and the description is trimmed down. But because you've rigorously excluded the unnecessary at every corner of the script, you actually have room to let the scene breathe. So there's a freedom in the scene. And if you need to let the dialogue run long or breathe or develop, you have that luxury, because everything is so tight. And the scene is the only thing that the audience actually sees. It's like that Michelin commercial where they talk about this square of rubber is the only part of your car that touches the road, so you should have good tires. The scene is the only thing people actually see. You don't usually hear people on the way out of the movie going, wow, did you check out that second act structure? They don't perceive that. But you still don't want the scene to be, even as you let life into the scene and let it breathe and flex, you don't let all the unnecessary stuff that you've been holding at bay flood in and clog up that scene. You let enough of it in to let the scene breathe and live and flow naturally. But it's still rigorous and tight. And so in this way, you jealously guard every single syllable that makes it into your script, using only that which is necessary. You also structure compelling conflict for the overall story, for each act, for each sequence, and for each scene. And the fact that each one of these units has compelling conflict in it keeps the audience consistently on the edge of their seats, because they don't know how each of these conflicts is going to be resolved. You set up a potential fight, touch off a fight to the finish. Even within that scene, the audience comes up on the edge of their seat, rooting for the protagonist. Can he or she pull it off here? Whether it's for a scene, a sequence, an act, you want each of them to be dramatically compelling in its own right and part of an overall conflict that is compelling. The audience is in doubt. That's the essence of drama. They don't know how it's going to turn out. They're always on the edge of their seat. Each scene is dramatic. 2 to 5 scenes make up a sequence. The sequence itself is dramatic. Roughly 2 to 5 sequences make up an act. The act itself is dramatic. And all the acts make up the overall story, which the overall structure of the story gets the audience on the edge of their seat. So every single part of it is dramatic. You never revert to mere story, to mere narrative. It's all been dramatized. So the audience is compelled to keep watching. You couldn't pay them to leave at the high point of suspense. And so in this way, you turn every particle of your script from mere narrative into drama. No part of your story is flat dramatically, because that's where you lose the audience. They're starting to check their watches. This is just information. You don't want any information in your story. You want all drama. And just like Rumpelstiltskin turned every piece of straw in that room into gold, you turn every piece of your story, every piece of story in your plot into drama. That is the essence of the craft of the dramatist. And if you can consistently do that to good stories, then you can be in the top 1% of all writers. 99% of all scripts are rejected. Most people do not have substantial craft as a dramatist. Many people have never even heard about it, and a lot of people rebel against it. That screws up my creativity. Well, good luck with that. So here we are looking at what I'm talking about with the structure. You apply these tools to the overall script, to each act, to each sequence, and to each scene. And here you can see it photographed from, this is from course 1 of a real script that we really built. So on top, we have, this is reverse cause and effect for the overall story. And this is a conflict map where you set up a potential fight, touch off a fight to the finish, 2/3 of the 3/4 through the story. The audience comes up on the edge of their seat with a question in their mind about how this conflict will be resolved. Can they win or not? That kind of thing. And if the question is weak, then the drama that you're proposing is weak. And then there's the back and forth of the rest of the fight. So you're doing tight cause and effect and structuring the conflict to really engage the audience. And then you complete that conflict. And then you do the same thing for Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Then this is sequence, proposition, plot. Then you do the same thing for each sequence. Reverse cause and effect, two-sided conflict, get the audience up on the edge of their seat. And then we've done the same thing for each scene. And in this particular story, it's a thriller, it's a revenge fantasy. So there's a lot of things where people are plotting and scheming behind the scenes. So there's not always open conflict. So it doesn't always have the two-sided conflict map. But we've done sequence, proposition, plot for this scene, and then we write the scene. Sequence, proposition, plot for the next scene, and then write the scene. So here's the same thing closer up, the whole story, each act, each sequence. And it's a lot of work. It's always 24 rewrites. And so here you see it at the scene level, and then the scene actually gets written. And let's get a look at it close up. It's out of focus because the people that are taking course 1, I don't want them to know how the story comes together later on in the story. It's like watching a murder mystery and you know who did it. It ruins it for you because in course 1, you're working along with me to actually build the script, and it doesn't exist yet. We're making it up every day. And I filmed a new lesson every day and would stay up until 4 a.m. figuring out the next step in the plot. And the students had the assignment to help me figure it out. And even though I can't interact with what they've done for their assignment because it was filmed a while ago, I'm saying, okay, so how did they solve this particular thing? We still haven't figured that out yet. So your assignment is to, figure out 20 ways that they would sneak that gun into that room when nobody can get a weapon in that room. And they're wrestling with it. They're thinking about it. How could you actually do that? And so they're really working alongside me as we build the story. And it's as interactive as I could make it for a pre-recorded video, to the point that even here, when we've worked together to do sequence, proposition, plot for the overall story, and that was the first step, and that took a number of days. Then we did it for each act. Each one of those might have taken a day. Then we did it for each sequence. That's the bulk of the work. Doing the same 3 steps for each sequence, you're figuring it out in a fair amount of detail. Because next we do sequence, proposition, plot for this scene, and then write that scene. So the students actually write the script themselves based on the sequence, proposition, plot that we've created. Now I show them what I wrote, but they write it themselves. And so if this was for the scene, then you could see that we've gone backwards through what we've already figured out and thought it through in a little more detail, getting down to final detail. And you're paraphrasing dialogue, and you're setting up conflict within that scene so that scene itself, you set up a potential fight between protagonist and antagonist, touch off a fight to the finish, which gets the audience up on the edge of their seat, wondering how it's going to turn out. And you complete the action, you complete the conflict. So if you've done this for the scene, then you can actually write the scene, working off that structure. And it enables you to execute that scene clearly and cleanly, and that scene contributes toward the sequence that it's part of. And that scene contributes toward the act that it's part of, and it contributes toward the overall story. So this scene is a crucial part of the overall story. And there's full detail, but there's only what's absolutely necessary to make it work. And there's nothing extra. The script that we wrote in there came in at 133 pages and it was pretty clean. It moved well. It needed some work, but it was quite solid. And I went through it and did a lot of cuts and got it down to 130. And now in course 2, we're doing some revisions to it, but it's a clean, solid execution of what we created, developed, and constructed. And we put the energy that often goes into extensive rewrites into engineering the script properly before we actually wrote it. So that's a look at what course 1 looks like. That's a look at what craft as a dramatist looks like and how it can really help you and how it can help you have a career that is consistent and reliable. People want to hire you because you tend to be able to make things work. And they also hire you because you're good to collaborate with. So you got to have a lot of things working to succeed in the industry. And craft is a huge part of it. And the more that you perceive how valuable craft is and not only how much work is involved to master that craft, but what it gets you, what you're shooting for, it helps you go through all the work that it takes because there's no shortcut. So here's the overall story where we got it right in big, broad strokes. Then we do the same thing for each act, where we're thinking it through in a little more detail and making each act dramatic. Then we're doing the same 3 steps for each sequence. And we're dividing each sequence into scenes. And then we take these steps and we're actually taking what we had. This was that part of the sequence that constituted the scene. And we are building backwards. So we have the object is that Dirk accidentally scratches the chopper. The final effect is that Dirk stumbles against Heinz's chopper and scratches it. The cause of that is Dirk gets in Heinz's face defending Mindy. Heinz kicks him, which causes him to stumble against the chopper. The cause of Dirk defending Mindy is that Mindy will not back down, and Dirk is trying to keep her from getting hurt. The cause of that is the roar of a chopper from inside. Dirk yanks Mindy aside as the steel door slams open. Mindy hammers on the door with the butt of her 14-inch Bowie knife, and the cause of that is that Rammstein blasts through the neighborhood as Harleys roar up the street to greet the sunrise. They've been partying all night with loud music and gunshots. Mindy sits up in bed, black circles under her rabbit eyes. She has had enough. Grabbing her 14-inch blade from the wall, she marches out the front door, muttering death threats as Dirk staggers to his feet after her. So this causes this, which 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 gets us to the objective of the scene. And all of that is an expansion of this, which we had already figured out. We went backward through this and just thought it through in a little more detail, but that's final detail. Then we structured the conflict to this scene. We took what we had here, and we put it in the form of a 2-sided conflict that sets up the potential fight, touches off the fight to the finish for this scene, gets the audience up on the edge of their seat with the specific question in their mind, which is what's dramatic about this scene. The fact that they have this question in their mind means that the scene has been dramatized. They're engaged. It's not mere information. And then a completion of the conflict. So we said the initial act of aggression is that the bikers are revving up even more as sunrise approaches. Justified retaliation on the part of the protagonist in this scene, Mindy loses it and charges down there to bang on their door, yelling to shut up. Aggravation of the issue, Heinz smashes out through the door and almost runs her over. The precipitating act, Mindy will not back down and explodes in his face, trying to kill him with her knife. And what we did is that because Dirk is the protagonist of the overall story, we initially had him taking the lead in some of the later part of the scene. But when we actually started structuring the conflict in this scene, somebody said, Mindy's the one that's really got most of the drive. So instead of giving this action to Dirk, we said, well, let's keep it on Mindy. She's the one that's making stuff happen here. So we adapted and adjusted. And so she will not back down and explodes in his face, trying to kill him with her knife. He's smashed out through the door and tries to run her over. And she is feisty. She will not back down, and she's in his face. And she's not just waving a knife down. She's trying to stick him. She wants to gut him. So it's an active war. And the audience comes up on the edge of their seats, like with this question in their mind, will she actually get them to shut up, or will he hurt her? So it's a highly specific question. We're getting at what the audience is up on the edge of their seats about, and then we complete the action. So Hines circles quickly and tries to run her over again. Dirk tries to restrain Mindy, but she struggles out of his grasp. Hines revs his engine and runs at her again. Mindy is completely unintimidated and cuts a huge long scratch in his bike with her knife. So initially we had Dirk doing it by accident, but we were like, no, it's actually much better if Mindy really sticks to her guns and just does it on purpose. That's even more of an act of war. And it doesn't mean the fight's over, but we've completed one complete fight within this scene. So then we actually write the scene, and we're working from both this and this. So we're reading from the bottom up, and we're folding this into it as well. So we have interior veterans home, pre-dawn. Dirk hears Harleys revving their engines and sees jubilant bikers roaring up the street as the sun starts to rise. Mindy sits up in bed, stark black circles under her rabbit eyes. She's had quite the fuck enough. Grabbing her 14-inch blade from where it's stuck in the headboard, she marches out the front door in her nightgown, muttering death threats. Dirk staggers to his feet and follows after her, poking a drowsy vet on his way out. Dirk, wake Gunny up, okay? Shit's going sideways big time. Exterior, biker's factory door, pre-dawn. A livid Mindy hammers loudly on the door with the butt of her Bowie knife, yelling at the top of her lungs. Mindy, turn this fucking music off and die, you ignorant lop-eared pieces of shit. She keeps hammering and screaming as Dirk catches up with her. From inside comes the huge roar of an engine, and Dirk snatches Mindy aside just as the steel door explodes outward and caroms hard off the wall. Mindy would have been splattered, but she's furious at Dirk and fights free of his grip. Hines roars out through the door on an insanely loud Harley chopper and swerves to hit Mindy as Dirk jerks her back just in time. Hines does a fishtail turn and comes to a stop facing Mindy, ready to charge again, but she rushes at him screaming bloody murder, slashing at him with her knife. Mindy, gonna chop your nuts right off. His eyes go wide with fear and he guns it out of her way. Circling quickly, he comes around and tries to run her over again. As Dirk struggles to pull her out of the way, she reaches out and gouges a wicked long jagged scratch in the new Harley's paint with the sound of a nail on a chalkboard. Everything grinds to a halt in silence as collective gasps echo from the stunned bikers as faces peer out from every window in the factory. So you can see that we went from having a rough sense of the scene in a reasonable amount of detail. It was part of the sequence that we'd already figured out, which was part of the act, which was part of the overall story. But we went from having this to going backwards through it one more time and thinking it through in just a little more detail. What would this look like when he smashes open the front door? What would we actually see in full detail? So we see the roar of a chopper from inside. Dirk yanks Mindy aside as the steel door smashes open with a massive crash, as Heinz charges through on his roaring new Harley chopper. Mindy is furious and struggles free from Dirk. So we said, okay, so what would that actually look like? And that's final detail. You can write it. And then we also created conflict. And so the scene, you can see, is well written. It's tight. There's conflict. There's drama. There's nothing unnecessary in it. It moves well. It's compelling. It's funny. It's got action. That's the essence of this technique, is that this isn't going to take a whole lot of rewrites. Sure, you can tune it up. You can add some stuff. You can clean it up. You can clarify things. But it's a good execution of what we structured. And this scene is tight and dramatic. And it's part of this sequence, which is tight and dramatic. And this sequence is part of this act, which is tight and dramatic. And this act is part of the overall story, which is tight and dramatic. So we sketched out the broad strokes of the story, figured out a little more detail and dramatized each act, figured out a little more detail and dramatized each sequence, figured out a little more detail at the scene level and dramatized it, and then wrote it. So I hope that makes it much less abstract. This is a highly specific set of things you can learn and master and do and be able to write good script.